also a P4, obviously. And I did my rotations all over the place between Rhode Island and New York, and I matched with the Bay Pines VA healthcare system in Bay Pines, Florida.
Hi everyone, my name's Ugene, also P4. I did most of my rotations in Rhode Island and like one in Texas, and I matched with a residency in New Jersey. It's called Cooperman Barnabas Medical Center.
Haley is having some technology issues with Wi-Fi, so she keeps getting booted. So she's trying to figure it out from her phone, but she's having some trouble.
Okay. I could do a quick little intro for her if that's fine. Okay, so our last panelist is Haley Parker, and she matched with, hold on. Oh my God, if I can make it bigger. Wait, does anyone?
I think it's like Vidant. She's going to North Carolina.
Yes.
It's
Vidant.
Carolina.
Vidant.
Yeah.
And she was a longitudinal student at Boston Medical Center.
Yeah. Thank you. Hopefully we can get her Wi-Fi up and working. But in the meantime, so we have some pre-written questions for you guys, and then I'll open it up to anyone else who has a question. So our first question is, can you explain like the residency that you matched with, and kind of just like an overview of what they do?
I can start off. So the residency that I matched with, so Cooperman Barnabas Medical Center is more of like a community hospital, and it's like a general PGY1. So in the sense, it has like a lot of different kinds of rotations. So it had like transplant, pediatrics, geriatrics, as well as like some other like ambulatory care focused stuff. So that way I get like a, like a variety of rotations that I could have depending on if I want to change. But for like right now, I was interested in its PGY2 program in geriatrics. And so that's currently my big interest at the moment. And so it does have like a very good focus in that regard.
Yeah, I think when looking at programs, kind of asking what your interests are and seeing if that aligns with programs is important. So for me, I knew that ambulatory care or providing outpatient care was really important to me. So I looked at programs that were going to allow me to spend at least half the year in an outpatient setting. Boston VA will let me spend up to 75% of my year in outpatient if that's what I decide as the year progresses. So that was something that was important to me. I think in terms of starting to think about those things when you're on your API rotations, ask yourself if you're enjoying the ICU, if you're enjoying inpatient, or if you, prefer your community rotations, your ambulatory care rotations, and that can kind of help you center in on some programs.
I definitely echo everything that has been said already, but for my program, UConn Health, it's myself and 3 other residents. So there's 4 total residents. And this is something that I really looked at when looking for rotations, also how many residents there is, how big the hospital is. For me, I knew I wanted to stay close to home. I'm from Connecticut, so I was looking for programs in the Connecticut area because I knew I wanted to stay in that area. And like Ugene, I am just doing a general PGY1, and UConn Health offers so many different electives from emergency medicine. They have a big AmCare population as well. So I just was looking for a program that had all of my interests so I could take electives in areas that I wanted to get a little bit more experience in. But that's pretty much why I fell in love with that program and why I'll be going there.
Yeah, for me, similar to kind of what everyone else has said, a lot of it had to do with kind of what they offered that were my interests. So right now, pediatrics is kind of my main interest, but I still wanted to do like a general residency just in case there was something else that I experienced and kind of fell in love with instead. So I kind of looked for programs that offered a pediatric required rotation, because you have your required rotations, then the electives, as well as opportunities for more pediatric electives. And I know as I kind of got into it more, looking for programs that had like ID rotations, because that's not necessarily something that is a strength of mine. So I wanted to be able to make sure I could get some more experience with that, with something that I was interested in. And I also I know some programs do like 4-week rotations, where I'll be actually just 5-week rotations, which I liked to be able to get a little bit more time with each rotation.
So I have to echo with everything that all my fellow classmates said. But one thing that drew me to the Bay Pines VA was that it's a kind of a typical VA residency that has a whole bunch of different rotations, both in the inpatient, outpatient side. Tend to prefer the outpatient rotations. So they have also a bunch of elective opportunities in that area. And also it drew me to the VA in general is that it's a great place to work from what I understand. So getting in there early with residency can provide a great networking opportunity, also plenty of career opportunities down the line.
Hi, sorry, I didn't get the chance to introduce myself before. My Zoom has kicked me out about 4 times, and what drew me to my program specifically was the flexibility that it offered. I think it's about to kick me out again, so I'm so sorry. But my program had a lot of flexibility with the rotations that it offered. I only have 6 required rotations, and my rest are, oh, I'm frozen.
Oh boy. Okay. While we
Sorry.
wait. Oh,
Am I
she's back. Okay, she's back.
Am I frozen again? I'm so sorry. I don't know what is happening. I restarted my computer. I'm just gonna give up.
Okay. Well, if Haley, if your laptop starts working again, feel free to answer the questions. It was pretty good. But okay. Well, thank you guys for answering that. So moving on to our next question. So can you guys walk us through your ranking process and like why you ranked some above others?
So for me, ranking was actually really hard because I really enjoyed all of my programs, some a little bit more than others. So that's what made it a lot more difficult to rank. But for me, it was mainly the opportunities it provided, how many outpatient rotations, and also what the electives were like, because ASHP has a set requirements for most residencies on what they can provide. So it's basically the electives and also the outside of rotation features that share some of my other that made me rank one program over another.
Yeah, I would agree with Erin. That's kind of how I started my process. And then also too, throughout like interviews and things like that, like you'll just kind of get like overall vibes from programs and you're talking to people and really just kind of going with your gut, I feel like is the best advice that I can give, because like you can kind of get an idea whether you'll get along with them, because that's also part of it too. You want to be somewhere that you're going to enjoy. So that was kind of like the second thing that I kind of added on to my like thought process when I was trying to figure out exactly what to do, was kind of like how I felt in talking to them, and even like the types of questions that they asked me throughout like interviews.
Yeah, I think a couple important things with ranking is don't be afraid to ask yourself honest questions. Like I ended up interviewing with a couple of programs that I didn't end up ranking. So even if originally you think the program is something that you're interested in, don't be afraid to like be honest with yourself and make sure that you're only ranking programs that you're comfortable ending up at. I would also say that, and I talked to Erin about this some too, but a lot of the difficulty in ranking is that you'll kind of get bunches of programs and you'll be like, oh, like, how do I decide between these two or these two? And I tried to ask myself, like, what matters to me about that program? So I look at rotations, but then I'd also look at things like, I hate packing my lunch. So do they have a cafeteria? And like, it sounds silly, but that's actually something that's important and would be important to like spending a year somewhere. So while the clinical side of things can be important, make sure that you're looking at the whole picture, make sure you're thinking about, you know, would I want to live there? Are there things for me to do outside of residency, and weigh that appropriately as well.
I agree with everything that everyone else has said. Like Bree has said, definitely see how you're feeling after the interview. There were some programs that I didn't end up ranking after I interviewed. So I think definitely seeing how during the interview, how you got along with everyone, if you could see yourself being there for a year. And like Mike said, definitely weighing all the other stuff besides the clinical stuff, like parking is a big thing. I know a lot of programs you have to pay for parking, there's garages, you have to take a shuttle. So it definitely, there's a lot of things to take into consideration, especially electives, some required rotations. I know like Bree's into pediatrics, but if someone doesn't want a pediatric mandatory rotation, then avoiding a program that would have that. So there's definitely a lot to take into consideration. I had trouble creating my rank list just because I did like so many of the programs, but at the end of the day, just creating like a pro con list and making sure that you really, any program that you rank, that you could see yourself being there for a year, because if you rank them, there's a chance that you will end up going there. So just making sure that you would be happy at any of those programs is important.
To kind of tag along to all what everyone said, because those are all great points, there is going to be like a bright space folder that actually includes like the helpful like tips to like what factors to consider. So I actually use that a lot. So it includes stuff like how many residents, how often do you have to do like weekend staffing, and it really kind of put a lot of stuff into perspective for me, because it's like, you know, you're considering like all of these other factors, and it's like, oh, what about all of these ones as well? So just like, you know, use your resources as much as you can, just snoop around. There's also, I think, like some stuff online on SSHP that kind of helps you like put it better into perspective. In addition, just like another factor is depending on where you are in your life, whether you're going to be, say, for example, if you have like a fiance or like a significant other, or if you have like a family that you want to live with, I would recommend maybe like asking for their opinion if you're like still kind of stuck, because it's actually what I did, because I ended up consulting both my brother and my sister to kind of like figure out like, I had like a lot of little bunches, so like trying to determine how to like, you know, make that tiebreaker really helped, just getting a little bit of their perspective, or maybe just asking like a mentor of some sort to kind of help you decide on that factor.
I do want to add something that I also took into consideration while ranking, is the ability for me to move somewhere here and live there for a full year, and how comfortable you might be there. For example, programs in New York, and for those of you who are not familiar with it, there's a lot of snow, and for some, I still ranked it very high, but I really did enjoy the program. So that's one of the cons I was going to have to weigh with the many pros of the program. So just one thing to keep in mind when ranking is also, are you willing to move there?
I don't know if Haley got it working, but
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I moved, so maybe my Wi-Fi will actually work. From what I've heard, I agree with what everyone said. Was the question about how we ranked?
Yes.
Okay. Honestly, I ended up kind of going mostly off of my gut. I applied. So as I kind of half introduced myself just before, I matched at Vidant Medical Center, which is a big academic medical center down in North Carolina. And something that I had done with a lot of the programs I applied to were very similar in that they had heavy critical care focuses and a lot of similar opportunities. So I kind of went both. So I might have frozen. Can anyone hear me? Yes? Okay, cool. I'm so sorry. I've had literally no issues until this, but I really went based off of the vibes I got from the interview, because all my programs were pretty similar at baseline and had a lot of similar opportunities. So I went where I felt like the RPD was the most supportive, and all the residents seemed just like genuinely happy to be there, because I think that's a big thing at the end of the day too, is you don't want to go somewhere that you get a bad vibe from. If the RPD doesn't seem nice or the residents seem miserable, that's probably what you're going to get. So you definitely want to go somewhere that you feel like you're going to get a lot of support. And I also asked all of my programs about kind of the support and the mentorship and how they promote resident wellness. And any programs that had a weird reaction to that, I kind of immediately nixed, because you want a program that's very open to discussing how they support you too.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. So the next question is, can you guys kind of walk us through the interview process, and did you like prepare, or how did you prepare for the interviews?
Yeah, so basically your materials will be due sometime between the end of December and the start of January, and then you can expect to start hearing about interviews. I probably heard from my earliest program about a week in, but that was pretty early. And I was hearing from people, I think, pretty much through the end of January, if not later. So if you don't get any news immediately, don't freak out. After that, you just started scheduling interviews, and most of you will be on appies that could be your off block, but if it's not, just make sure you're running dates past your preceptor and kind of keeping that open chain of communication. But no preceptor is going to give you a hard time about taking time off. You can always offer to like do extra projects or make that time up, but for the most part, they'll say that's your future, go take care of it. In terms of prepping for the interviews themselves, Dr. Ward does try and pair you with a mentor who's willing to do a practice interview with you. But I also just spent some time like looking through questions online or talking to friends about what questions they are, kind of preparing for. Most of it's pretty general interview stuff. Some programs will ask you some fun questions, some programs will ask you hard questions, but I think the best way to prepare is just bouncing ideas off of other people as it comes to be.
Yeah, like Mike said, a lot of once you start getting offered interviews, they'll have you rank certain dates. So it's tough because you want to make sure you don't rank dates that would overlap. So if you're saying you're ranking like March 1st as your one, you want to make sure that you don't rank that date number 1 or even 2 for another program, or else you possibly could be scheduled for an interview on the same day. So it's just important that you don't schedule 2 interviews on the same day accidentally. So that's really important. But once you do get offered interviews, I made like flashcards with like the most common questions. A lot of them are going to be like, tell me about yourself. So make sure you have an elevator pitch ready to go. Make sure you're able to talk about interventions that you made on rotations. So when I was on rotations, I kept an Excel spreadsheet of every intervention I made, which is really helpful because half the time we forget the interventions we made. So I could go back and look at this before my interviews, and I had like points that I was quickly able to talk about because I had wrote them down while they happened. So that was extremely helpful during interviews. And just strengths and weaknesses, you're always going to get asked on. So there's definitely, like Mike said, Dr. Ward has a great job on the Brightspace page with a bunch of things to prepare for the interviews. But besides that, if you just search like most commonly asked interview questions, there's a bunch that comes up. So I just made sure I had an answer for pretty much every interview question I could find on that Excel sheet.
Yes.
One thing I do have, all right, Bree, go ahead.
So I was kind of like, similar preparation to all that Megan and Mike said as well. Something I will kind of like add to that is that some interviews might require you to do some type of like extra presentation or show like some type of work that you've done throughout the school year, whether it be like journal clubs, patient case presentations, and they'll give you all of that information kind of once you are invited, so you have an idea. But I know for me personally, it was super helpful. I had a preceptor who very thankfully offered her time to kind of help go through my like presentations and things like that for my interviews with me. And I think that if you are able to kind of have someone, whether it be like a preceptor or a teacher, even if it's someone non-pharmacy, that can just kind of help look over some of your stuff prior to the interview. I know for me, it helped with a lot of like my stress of making sure I had no like spelling errors and like the formats were good. And like she also helped me sometimes with kind of like how to set things up because she has experience going through that. And it was something that definitely helped me with my nerves going through it, to have somebody that I can ask those types of questions to.
So I just want to go back to something that Megan said earlier about scheduling the dates for it. I know this happened way too many times for me, is that I always got these emails that I got an interview right when round started my rotation. By the time I came back to answer the emails, almost all days or times that I chose were gone. So I don't want all of you to worry that if you don't respond right away, you're not going to get a time. You will get a time. It might not be your number 1 day, but many of these RPDs are very accepting of the fact that we don't check our emails every 5 seconds, and can either reschedule someone else or push you into a spot that they didn't have before. So don't freak out if for some reason a date doesn't show up or gets taken away. Something will happen. And one thing I also want to add is that definitely sign up for the program that Dr. Ward will send out probably in a couple months for a mentorship with some pharmacists. Either normally they're a PGY2 or an actual, or not actual, a career pharmacist, but they will have plenty of advice, and they will also help you edit your CV and practice interviews with you, because they already went through this either in person or through Zoom, as all of us did, and they have a lot of advice for us.
I think everyone said like a lot of stuff that's like that I probably already would have said, but I did just also want to add just like another thing to consider is like when you're looking at like when you get that interview invite, to see how long the interviews are, because I think the shortest interview I personally had was like an hour and a half, and the longest was 8 hours straight. So just make sure that you have like snacks ready, that you have water, because sometimes some programs are very good about like, trying to schedule in the bathroom breaks and just like, having time to not stare at the screen, but just make sure to take that into account. So like, for example, if you unfortunately like miss the time that that like all the dates that like were more like, you know, like more convenient for you, as Erin was saying, because you were maybe on rotation, then if you have to do like like 2 interviews in a day, it is possible. It's just, you know, you just want to make sure that you're putting in enough time for yourself, you know, to eat and do all that stuff, because if you're dizzy and then you're trying to answer questions, it's not going to be a good time. So, yep.
And two, something, I don't know if anyone mentioned it and I missed it, but I didn't realize that a lot of interviews, not all of them, have a lot of clinical questions though. And I had 2 different interviews that had clinical cases where I actually had like one was a half an hour and one was a full hour, where they gave me a full patient case and you had to prioritize either like 5 problems, 3 problems, however many problems you saw, and you had to kind of work through the patient's top problems and then either send it in or talk through your answers. And it was something that I think all of us probably stressed out a lot about. But definitely it's good to review a lot of your clinical stuff beforehand, especially maybe if you've been mostly inpatient. Like I'd been mostly inpatient before my interview, so I reviewed a lot of like outpatient diabetes, hypertension, just making sure you view stuff you're not familiar with, but not to get too stressed out about it too, because at the end of the day, the clinical portion isn't make or break. The only thing they're looking for is that both you can like use your resources and that you're willing to accept if you don't necessarily know something, and let them know where you'd look it up.
To add on just like a last thing too, sorry, just to add on like a last thing that Haley mentioned, like if, for example, if you don't know, it's definitely okay to say the phrase like, oh, I'm really not sure about this. Yes, I would look it up. Or you can also say, I'd definitely follow up with you on that question. And it's actually good if you say that phrase and then you actually do follow up after that interview, preferably within the day of, if it's like not too late of a time with the person that asked the question. So it shows like, you know, like, oh, you have good continuity and stuff.
Great. Okay, so I have 2 questions in the chat. I'm just gonna ask this one first because it has to do with the interviewing. We have, what is the most challenging question you received in an interview?
Mine wasn't, I feel like it caught me off guard more than anything else. It's not like it was like, you know, a super complex patient case or anything, but one of the interviewers asked me, what is the nicest thing anyone has ever done for you? And I was like, I don't know, mind blown by that. And I didn't really know what to say, but they gave me some time to think about it and I came up with an answer eventually.
I think for me, mine was also something that I was not expecting, but one interviewer asked me about some Quizlets I made for and review sheets I made for some classmates a couple of years ago. So that really threw me off guard. So it's one thing I have to say is just always be on your toes, because you could be asked really weird personal questions that you might not think your interviews would know about you.
I also remember, oh, sorry, Brie. One person asked me like the difference between emergency use authorization and like expanded use or something, like very specific. Expanded access, yeah, like very specific FDA terminology. And I was like, what in the world? But I just like answered to the best of my ability, and they kind of like laughed off the fact that I didn't know bits of it. So it's always okay to say you don't know something, and like Ugene said, if it's something you can actually follow up on, you'll kind of get a gut feeling if it's something to follow up on or not.
I think for me, like one of the hardest or like most challenging things that I got asked was kind of an easy question. I just wasn't expecting it as well. Is that when they say that anything on your resume or like CV is free game for them to ask you about, they really mean it. During my interview, I work in a hospital, so I had on, you know, my CV some of like the programs listed out that we use that I'm like trained in. And during an interview, I had the RPD of the program asked me what I think is the most challenging or hardest part about using Pyxis machines in a hospital, because their health system was switching over from using Omnicell to Pyxis. So I had an entire conversation with them about Pyxis machines and like the software, which like thankfully, you know, I use and know pretty well, but it was something I never expected to really be asked about. And then one thing that was just kind of challenging is, you know, usually you ask like, what is your like strength or what is your weakness. I had a program in one sentence asked me to list my top 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses instead of 1 and 1. And so for me, that was something that like was challenging to really talk that much about myself. So I definitely say like have a lot of different things prepared to talk about yourself in particular.
I think 2 weird ones I got asked. Got asked if I said, picture yourself in 5 years from now, you just won some prestigious award. What is that award? Like, what is it for? And I just never even heard of that question before. So I was just like, I have absolutely no idea. So that one I had to think for a little bit. And then one of my interviewers asked me if I preferred pie or cake, which I just like paused for a second because it went from a very serious question to that question. And I was like, can you repeat that? I think I heard you wrong. So those, I think the first one was probably my most challenging. The other one was probably my most expected, just because like they'll throw some weird stuff at you sometimes in interviews just to see how you react to getting an unexpected question.
Going off of Haley's, I was asked to list all the different uses of an ice cube that I can list in a minute. And they just want to see your thought process pretty much. Like Haley said, they just sometimes ask these random questions to see how you react to it. There's no right or wrong answer. So I was just started listing all the possible uses for an ice cube. But besides that, a program asked me they were like, tell me about a time where something was unfair at work and how you handled it. And I thought this was really difficult because I didn't want to like bash on my place of employment. So trying to find a situation that I thought was unfair, that wasn't like exposing my institution was kind of difficult. And when they ask you this in a minute, like I was like freaking out. And like I quickly took a few seconds, thought of a scenario and was able to answer it appropriately. But sometimes you just can't prepare for every situation possible. There was a few times where I was like, that was a great question. Do you mind if I think about it for a few seconds? And they're like, absolutely, take your time. So they understand that they're asking challenging questions, and they let you take time to like think about it for a little bit. So it's not something to be worried about.
I definitely agree with Megan in terms of like, I think some of the hardest questions is like end up being something where it's like you kind of have to, you're trying your best not to insult whatever they're asking you for. So like, for example, what was your least favorite rotation? And then also like, what difficulty did you have with like another customer or like, like, or like with a coworker or something? Or when did you ever have an argument with like somebody that was in charge of you? So like trying your best to, be polite as much as possible. And, you're really trying not to bash the other person. It's really just like, how well can you handle like this difficult situation? And did you learn anything from it? So just, like word of caution, make sure that you're not just insulting whatever they're asking for is that one. But so that was definitely one. And then the other one was kind of, I don't know if it's really a question, but one of my programs that I had interviewed for actually asked me to follow instructions on how to build a paper boat. And it's currently sitting on my desk, but I kid you not, I could not follow them for the life of me. And the purpose of this, I think it's a lot more situational too, is like to see like how well do I take instructions and how well did I like, like how well can I ask for help in that regard? So it's like I'm just sitting there like, wait, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? So that one was actually like a really fun one that I ended up doing a lot more like they're literally like observing your behavior in like different types of settings, which is kind of cool. Cause like, I think like most people tend to do like kind of like like here are just some questions, just answer them. And then they gave like more situation circumstances. And I think this was also the same interview. They ended up making me make a presentation in under like 15 or in 10 minutes and then present for like 2. So that was an interesting program.
They also like to know about failure. I don't know if anyone else mentioned that. Every single program will ask you something about a time you failed or a time something didn't turn out the way it's going to go, because they want to see how you can handle talking about your failure. And if you try and make excuses or cover it up, or if you're willing to be like, yeah, I didn't do so great at this, and here's kind of how I would go about it the next time. So just definitely make sure to be prepared to talk about failure, as unfun as it can be. And like, I know it's hard to talk about, but they want to see that you can kind of handle talking about it and that you're not just going to get super defensive.
I will say too, we're talking about the hard questions, but you will get a lot of cookie cutter questions. And if you have multiple interviews, you'll get some of the same questions over and over again. So you'll be pretty well prepared with an answer. Definitely be prepared to talk about at least 3 strengths, at least 3 weaknesses. You want to have examples of, time you spoke to a patient, a time you talked to a provider, a time you had to confront a manager, a time you had to confront a coworker, a time you managed conflict, a time you failed, a time you did something well. How do you respond to feedback? All of those things that you think of as cookie cutter questions, or you've probably been asked in an interview in the past, will still come up in these interviews.
Yeah, and to kind of like add the 2 of those together, I know we've kind of talked about like interventions and things that were kind of good things. I also got asked about interventions that I made and were accepted, or that were kind of, either like ignored by providers, or like weren't accepted, or that it became like some type of like a problem. And they kind of asked you to talk about those and like what happened, why it happened. And then I always got asked what I thought I could do better in the situation. So even thinking about the things that you've done well in rotation interventions, or interventions that maybe they were good interventions, but they just weren't taken. So you don't necessarily think of them as an accomplishment, but just have like some things like those in the back of your mind as well to be able to talk about.
Awesome. Those are really great answers, guys. So a lot of people have questions about like interviews and stuff like that. So I'm just gonna kind of roll through them. So the next question is, how many programs did you apply to and how many interviews did you get from that?
So this is a difficult question because everyone would be different. Personally, I applied to, I believe, 12 programs, 2 of which were Indian Health Service residencies. So those were non-traditional. I'd say I heard of people applying in the single digits. I heard people who applied to 20 plus. I'd say most people I know did receive multiple interviews, but I do know people that applied to a significant amount of programs and, only got 1 or 2. So something I was told going into it was expect 50% of the interviews from the programs you apply to, but that's not really a steadfast rule and isn't going to be true for everyone. So I think something important to keep in mind is what type of programs you're applying to. Are you applying to the small community hospital down the street that has 2 positions and you had a rotation there and the staff personally, or are you applying to Mass General Hospital or Mayo Clinic, which are like top hospitals in the country for every program you can imagine? And being able to kind of have that self-reflection and honesty with yourself to say, is this somewhere I could see myself and somewhere I think I'll really get a good chance at it?
To also kind of add on to that. So I think that when you're applying, it's also like when you're writing like the letters of intent and you're thinking like about like which ones you really do want to end up applying to, make sure that you place like a lot of thought into it, make sure that it's like very personal as much as you can, but also, yeah, make sure that you're also, I would recommend try to have like a bigger reach if you can. So not bigger reach as in like more programs, but like larger, like location wise. Like for example, for myself, I ended up applying in Texas because I'm from Houston, Texas. I also applied into like the Northeast New England kind of area. And then I also applied to like 1 program in like Portland, Oregon, just because like I really had like specific, like I had an idea of like, I do want to go into Jerry. So I kind of tailored it into that regard. But yeah, really the numbers don't necessarily, like I don't want to say the numbers don't necessarily matter. Like it's really up to your preference, because like also remember that each application is going to cost like a certain amount of money. Don't necessarily let that limit you in that regard, but I do want to add that as like a warning, so that way you're understanding that like, yes, you could go ahead and apply to more than like 20, but then you have to put into that cost. So it's like it's risk reward kind of deal, if that makes sense.
I'd have to agree with 100% with what Ugene just said. Everything, because I also applied to many programs in the Northeast, New England, and around the country as well, Florida, and places in North Carolina as well. But I also want to mention is that not only do the like applications themselves cost money, potentially on how things look around interview time next year, you might have to travel to the respective hospitals, and that can cost a pretty penny. I know Mike spent $1,000 going to one of his interview sites for just one of them. And if you apply to 14 of them or so, that's a lot of money that you can be spending. Fortunately for most or all of us, almost all of our interviews were virtual, which saved a lot of money and kind of offset the cost of me applying to more than 10 programs. So that's something to keep in mind depending on how the circumstances are next year. But I do know many of the programs do like doing these virtual interviews because they get a broader applicant pool rather than just the schools in the areas around the hospitals.
I will say too, like weigh the risk and benefit of that, because I did travel to one of my interviews and not a lot were on site this year, but next year they might be. But I think actually going there was really like significant and eye-opening for me as well, and really gave me a good gauge of what the program was as opposed to just meeting people virtually. So it is expensive and you can weigh that, but it can be important to visit people on site as well.
I think too. Oh, Haley, you can go.
I was gonna say, yeah, definitely what everyone else has said, take money into account. I'll say I think a lot of people I know applied kind of an average I saw was between like 9 to like 14 or 15 programs. I'll say I applied to 14 and spent over $500. So definitely the money is something that's important to take into consideration, because the more programs you apply, the more it's going to add up. And another important thing is like what Mike had said earlier about the different programs. And kind of how that affects your numbers. If you are applying to big programs like Mass General, Mayo Clinic, a lot of the big Boston hospitals or like big hospitals in New York City, those get hundreds and hundreds of applicants for like 5 or 6 spots. So it's really important to take that into consideration, that if you apply to all programs that are like that, you might get a smaller percentage versus if you mostly stick with programs you did interviews with or kind of have connections at, you might get a higher number. But overall, yeah, I don't think it's about the number. I think it's definitely apply to what you feel comfortable with, but definitely give yourself a good amount that are, don't just straight apply to Mass General and like Mayo Clinic. Definitely apply to ones that have a lot of other attributes and that you know are within your reach.
Yeah, and add on to like with not necessarily like numbers, I also don't think that just because you have more like interviews and things like that doesn't necessarily, I'm gonna say increase your chances, but it's more about how you do with your interviews and how prepared you are and how like enthusiastic you are to talk to the programs than necessarily the number. So like say somebody could get one interview and still end up matching at that program just because they had a fantastic interview with that program, or somebody could have, 8 or 9 interviews and not end up matching at all because they just weren't prepared for interviews. So I think it's more of taking what you have on your plate and doing really well with that. Instead of focusing on either like, oh, I got this because I have so many interviews, or, telling yourself, oh, I'm not going to match because I only have one interview. So I think it's just being like optimistic and still working hard throughout the process, no matter how many interviews you end up getting.
They're also exhausting, by the way. Even the shorter ones are incredibly emotionally draining. I know just even doing the ones that I did after I finished my last one, I sat there and I was like, I don't think I could have done another one of them because they're just so emotionally draining. So kind of like what Brie was saying, you could know someone that got more than 10 interviews, but they could be so emotionally drained that the last couple of them, they really don't give their best on, and that might have been one of their top programs. I do know someone that did in the double digits of interviews, and talking to her afterwards, she was so insanely exhausted and drained by the process. She wished she had turned more of them down because she felt by the end she was just so drained from it all. So that's important to consider too, because like Ugene said, they vary a lot in time. And I had a couple that were like 6 to 8 hours long, and you literally afterwards you like get off and you just have to lay on the couch and zone out for like a couple hours. They're really exhausting.
All right, I feel like we're being downers, so I'm just gonna throw in a couple of positive things. Some interviews will be fun too. Like I ended up talking about pizza in interviews. I ended up talking about Ted Lasso in interviews. I talked about LeBron James in interviews. So like sometimes I get a good interviewer and you'll have some fun. So don't think it's all like work hard, no play. And like some of them as a result will be like more fun than others. And I also just want to say, like, we've had students from URI who have matched at top programs in the country. So I'm not saying don't put yourself out there and don't apply to those programs. But just make sure that like you're really thinking about the places you're applying and if those align with you, and if you see them as a possibility, to make sure that you're kind of getting the most bang for your buck. But sorry, Eugene.
No, you're good. Just like a little thing that I wanted to add, I know Haley mentioned like spending more than like 500 for all the applications. For those who identify, I think it's BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, persons of color, there is a scholarship. It's for $500. I did actually receive that scholarship, so I highly recommend it. I need to find the exact name for it, but I'm going to include it in the chat. So for anyone who is interested in applying for residencies next year, I highly recommend. And I'm pretty sure they're going to keep doing this in the future. So let me just go find that link, so that way you guys can like be aware of it, because it is free money.
Dr. Brown is heavily involved in that scholarship too. So if any of you know Dr. Brown, she can give you guidance.
Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you guys for answering that one. We have a few more questions about the interviews. So I'm just gonna put this together. Were you able to take notes during the interviews? And were a majority of your interviews one-on-one or group interviews?
I can start for this one, if nobody else wants to go. So I did take notes during a lot of my interviews, but a lot of it necessarily wasn't like what they were saying exactly, because a lot of it is them going over things that you can find on their website, kind of what their program has to offer. I wrote down a lot of notes more so on like how I felt talking to them, like if I liked this person, kind of like the experience that I had, just so after the fact I could kind of compare those things, because it's a lot easier to compare like their offerings for their websites versus like kind of how you felt during the program. So I definitely like did take notes throughout that experience. I forgot what the second part of the question was.
It was, were your interviews more one-on-one or were they group?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the program. So some are one-on-one, some are group. I personally had an interview where in the span of 4 hours, I talked to 21 different people, because all of my interviews were just me, and then like anywhere from 4 to 6 other interviewers in the Zoom room. So for the most part, I think for kind of everyone, you're going to be by yourself in terms of the people being interviewed, but you could be with a handful of people that are interviewing you. So for me, a lot of it were kind of like different groups of people. So at like the program that I matched, they had a group that was kind of like their like pediatric pharmacists. They had people that were more of like their admin group. So they kind of had like 4 or 5 people that were kind of grouped together based off of where they kind of worked and what they do. And they were only interviewing one candidate at a time, but you were with a lot of other people. And I would say they definitely do try to make it a lot less intimidating, because it is kind of, it's scary going into a room with like 5 people who already know each other and they're all asking you questions, but they do, in my experience anyway, try to have it be a little more relaxed, especially in those larger settings, so you don't feel like as uncomfortable. And everybody kind of contributes to the conversation, in my experience at least, so it's not just like one person asking the question, then you move on to the next person asking the question. They all kind of contribute to your answers and things like that along the way. But you will have some that are kind of more one-on-one interviews.
Like Bree said, I definitely would take notes about how I was feeling during the interview, after the interview, and I would try and write down any questions that I remembered that kind of stumped me. So if I got asked them again in the following interview, I was able to maybe think of a better answer than I was able to on the spot. So that's something I did, and I compiled like a bunch of questions that I was asked just so I can prepare for the next interviews that I had. And as far as how many people in an interview, like Bree said, it's definitely going to vary. I had some where it was one-on-one with the program director, and then I had some where it was like 5 people on the Zoom room and me. So it definitely is going to depend, but most programs will send you an itinerary either like the day before or a few days before. So you should be able to see you'll have like a schedule of kind of who you're talking to and when. So hopefully before the interview, you'll be able to get a gauge of whether it's going to be like more one-on-one or it's going to be you and a bunch of clinical pharmacists or a bunch of staff pharmacists. So when you have the itinerary, you should be able to see that. But like Bree said, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's you and a group of pharmacists or the group of residents, everyone tries to make you feel extremely comfortable. You're going to have to introduce yourself like 5 times during the interview, just because you're constantly going to meet new people. They want to know your interest. You want to get to know them a little bit. So it's very repetitive with you kind of giving your elevator pitch. But at the end of the day, it's worth it. All these people just want to get to know you. And whether it's one person or a group of people, everyone's usually very friendly in the interviews. And I had a blast. So.
I also took notes, kind of similar to how Bree said. It was more of like what vibes I was getting. Like another program I matched with, I wrote down at one point like, oh, the RPD is so nice. Just because you want to remember the stuff like that afterwards. And I also, not that it's necessarily the same as notes, but like right after the interview, I know Bree can confirm, I called her after a couple and kind of talk through my feelings about the different programs, because sometimes it's easier to figure out your feelings if you say them out loud like immediately after. And then as far as like group versus individual, I definitely had a bit of both, kind of like how Bree and Megan both were talking about. I also did have one case in which all of the 4 candidates were in a room, and then they asked 2 of us the same question, and then 2, like the other 2, the opposite question. Like I know, for example, they asked 2 of us like, what are a good quality in a preceptor, and 2 like, what's a bad quality, but we were all in the same room for that. And I have heard that when they're in person, they try and do that more frequently to see how you interact with other candidates, because it's important that you're showing the other candidates your respect to, not just the pharmacist. And they also will set you up in little groups with the residents. And even if those seem non-formal, those are also like, you're still getting interviewed. So definitely be prepared for you to potentially be alone or in like a lunch group with the residents. A lot of times they'll set all the candidates and all the current residents together, and that'll kind of be a little group. But other than that, it was definitely a mix, like some one-on-ones, some where you have 3 or 4 pharmacists kind of all asking you questions.
I definitely took notes because I both on what I felt for the program and also the questions being asked, because I'm very forgetful, especially when a question has more than 2 parts. I won't remember the first part or the last part. So I always wrote the questions down. But I would always let the interviewer know that I am writing things down, just so they don't get thrown off that I'm scribbling something in the corner. And I also say the same thing at the beginning of every interview, because they also have to take notes on you, because they also probably don't remember all the 50 people they talk to. So I did take notes because I can't remember things. And in terms of like how many people were in my interview, I personally did not have any interviews where I was within another room with a student besides like the introduction and like the goodbyes. But I did have plenty of different interviews where I was with more than 3 or 4 like preceptors or members of the institution, which is a little bit stressful because that's a bunch of different people staring right at you. And you have to think of ways to either appease them or answer their question in a way that you don't seem unworthy for the institution, I guess.
My answer is basically going to be exactly what Erin said. So yeah, I definitely wrote notes. For me personally though, I also tried to include little, like what we discussed, like little anecdotes and stuff, especially if it was like with the RPD, because like when I send thank you notes, I tried to include something that we kind of talked about, just to show like, oh, by the way, it's me. I was the one who mentioned my really chubby dogs or something. So that way it kind of jogs the memory, kind of gives them like, oh yeah, it was this girl. But yeah, like I think aside from that, it's like exactly the same. Like I really wasn't in like an interview where I was like with another student, to be honest. I think the only time was like, yeah, during like presentations, for example, or even like clinical cases, like at the end of the presentation. But I do recommend that if you're going to be like, if you're going to do something where it's like you're watching other people present and they're presenting with you, if you do have a question about their presentation, it's totally okay to ask. If anything, it actually kind of looks nice, because that means that you're not just like focused on your, like hyper focused on yourself. It's like, oh, you're actually paying attention during. So, you know, it shows like good sportsmanship, I guess. But yeah.
Thank you guys. I know that we are pushing 7 o'clock. I have 3 more questions if people are willing to stick around and answer those. So the next question we have is, how would you recommend to prepare for mid-year?
Mid-year was interesting for us because they told us it was going to be in person, and we started looking for like hotel rooms and flights and all those sorts of things. And then we got I believe it was Omicron, Delta surge. I don't know. We had a COVID surge. So then they went online. So it was a little bit stressful for us, but it did make preparing easier as you didn't have to arrive at whatever location it was. I'm about 90% sure next year is Las Vegas. So that's something else to make sure you're budgeting money for. That's not covered by application fees or anything like that. So flight, hotel room, registering for the conference is all on your own dime as well. So make sure you're preparing for it financially, make sure you have appropriate dress for it. For the virtual one, I wore a suit, or for girls, the equivalent, but in person, it would be the same way. You'd want to dress in that way. I would also say making sure that you kind of have your CV around up to date by then is a good idea. Making sure that you've researched some programs before then. The easiest way to research programs is if you just Google SSHP residency directory. You can search geographically. You can also search by program type. So that's kind of where I started. And eventually you do get a list of programs for both the there's like a Northeast regional conference hosted by MCPHS, and then you get a list of programs for mid-year. So I also like went and looked at those lists, and then kind of, looked at programs I might be interested in. After that, you just kind of want to have some basic questions about those programs. If it's a program you're really interested in, you might want to have a slightly more in-depth question, but it's also appropriate to show up to mid-year and say, like, here are a few things I know about your program, like what brought you here, and kind of carry the conversation from there.
Don't stress too much about mid-year. Unless you royally say something awful, they're probably not going to remember you, which is like, it can sound bad, but honestly, it makes it you can kind of go into it and just learn, ask them questions. You can ask kind of basically anything. So I think that's a big thing, is don't overthink mid-year. Kind of definitely get a list of programs you want to talk to, and maybe talk to some of the lower ones on your list first to get out some nerves. But at the end of the day, remember that mid-year's for you. Mid-year's not for the programs. They're not going to remember you. It's for you to ask your questions and also get a good vibe. I know I keep using the word vibe, but it's incredibly important to make sure that you don't show up to mid-year and you might have this program that on paper looks absolutely perfect for you, and then you might talk to the residents and they seem incredibly run down, miserable, and all of them are looking elsewhere for their PGY2s. So I think definitely remembering mid-years for you is going to be one of the biggest ways you can prep, and then just getting an idea of the different programs you're looking at, and don't stress out too much because they really won't remember you.
Something that I appreciated during our mid-year experience was the fact that Dr. Ward and Dr. Charpentier were also giving us some suggestions. So for example, maybe you really don't know exactly what you're looking for. You might have some general idea, but then they might give you something that's in South Carolina, or if it's somewhere else that you hadn't thought of, and then they'll kind of just direct you. But that being said, if you're going to randomly go to any program, please do make the time just to look at what their brochure says prior to, please. The reason why I say that is because it looks very unprofessional if you start asking what rotations do you offer when it's clearly on the brochure. So just a quick scan before, if you've never heard of this program, just make sure that you're looking into all the things, and then try your best to ask more questions that of course that you're concerned about, just so that way they know that that you're prepared to some extent. And yeah, just in addition, just make sure that you keep an open mind while you're looking, because for all the perfect program you might not have been aware of at all. It might be in Nevada, of all places, or something like that.
I definitely agree with Eugene. There was a few times during mid-year where I was just put into a breakout room with either one resident or even like the residency program director. So if I didn't have questions or if I didn't look into that program a little bit, it would have just been like me and this one other person in a room, very awkward. So definitely make sure you're prepared to have questions, like make sure they're not on the website, make sure you can't find them anywhere else. But definitely just asking them about their experience is like the best way to kind of feel out the program and see if you would be good there. But definitely making sure you do your research before talking to a program is important, because you definitely can be caught one-on-one and you don't want to be in an uncomfortable position if you don't have to.
Yeah, and when you go into like talk to programs too, you don't necessarily have to ask questions that are super specific to that program, just more things that you can't find on their websites. Like one thing that I would ask was, especially with like the RPDs, is like, what's something that in your opinion, makes your program stand out? Because everyone kind of like admires different aspects of their program, and to me that kind of showed like what they thought was like important about their program. So even if you have a list of kind of like general generic questions you can kind of ask everybody, that's okay too. It doesn't need to be something that's super specific to that individual program. And then kind of like Haley mentioned on of maybe not going to like your favorite program first. I also would say for like mid-year, not necessarily saving your favorite program for last either. It's a very long day. It's a lot of talking. Sometimes you'll get to the end. I know I did, that there was programs I was planning on going to see and that they, were kind of my least favorite. And I just ended up not necessarily going to see them because I had just been overwhelmed by so much information and talking to so many different people, which is totally okay too. But I would definitely say not necessarily saving your favorite programs for last for that reason, just because you're kind of exhausted by the end of the day.
So one thing I have to add that can also apply to whether mid-year is in person or online again is to plan out your day or days depending on how the sessions are ran, because some programs will only be there if it's online for an hour or two. So you got to figure out when they're going to be around or if someone's going to be available to answer questions virtually. But the same thing applies if it's happening in person. ASHP will release out basically a map of the hall where the showcase will be happening, and include every program that's going to it, so you can figure out where they are and how to get there, and also figure out the order of which you want to go to your programs, as Bree and Haley mentioned, to make sure you have plenty of time and also have the energy to go to all of them, because it's a very tiring day, as Bree said. Even if it is online, it's still tiring. You're sitting down for 6-8 hours just talking to dozens of people about your future. It's very tiring.
Yeah, I would say in terms of the questions, the best advice I can give is, instead of coming and asking a question like, tell me about your residency, asking, tell me more about your cardiology rotation. That shows that you've actually like put interest into the program, and those questions will come across a lot better.
Great, thank you guys so much. So this next question is specific for Megan and Haley. And the question is, we know that you did a lappy for your rotations, and they want to know, how was the layout? Like, how many blocks was the lappy, and were you able to pick your rotations?
Yeah, I can talk a little on that. And also Bree also did a lappy. So the three of us actually all did lappy. So I did mine at Boston Medical Center, and that is a 3-rotation lappy. And the way that it was set up was kind of after I found out I got accepted, which was before you start picking the rest of your appies. They sent out kind of a list of what they offered, and I had to kind of rank a couple of the different choices. And at BMC, I did a critical care elective, I did a surgery elective, and then I also did my gen med that had an infectious disease focused. And I knew for me, I ended up looking at this lab because I wanted to do one that was only 3. I wanted to give myself the chance to see this hospital, BMC, that I was really interested in, but also to see another site, because I had never been in a hospital before and didn't know if that being in a large level 1 trauma center would be kind of overwhelming or would be something I liked. And I ended up really liking doing a longitudinal. For those, if anyone in here doesn't know what a lappy is, it's when you do multiple rotations at the same site and it's coordinated kind of through the site itself. And we have a couple different sites that URI does longitudinal programs through. And they kind of consider, like, some different programs, they call them their like mini residency, depending on how many rotations that you do there. And like I said, BMC was 3, and it's a great way to kind of get yourself prepared to be at a hospital for multiple rotations. And a lot of times they'll kind of add on some additional projects just because you're there for longer. You can stay there and you actually have a chance to do the data collection for longer. So I really liked it. I feel like being at BMC for 3 blocks helped me kind of get an idea of what inpatient rotations I was super interested in. And if it's something you could see yourself doing, I definitely recommend it. But if the idea of being at one site for that long kind of intimidates you because you don't know what you want to do yet, then it's also not a bad thing if you don't do it. Like, no one's going to look down on you for not doing a longitudinal. It's not going to be the one thing that makes you match either. It's just really helpful to kind of set up what you like and don't like.
Similarly to Haley, I did mine at Hartford Hospital and I loved it. So same thing, I did 3 of 6 there and I got to pick my rotations. So I had my 2 electives there. So I did medical ICU and I did transplant, and then I had my institutional, and mine weren't consecutive. So I had one block back to back, and then I was there like last month. So they weren't back to back, which is a little troubling if you don't live in the state. So it's definitely something to consider when you're applying to longitudinal blocks, that they may not be back to back for housing, which is something to consider. But I really liked it because it made the onboarding process so much easier. So I only had to go to orientation 1 time. I had my Epic login, I had my badge. So when I was back there for my second rotation, the first day I was able to jump right into it rather than call IT, like make sure my Epic access was working. And just like forming the relationships with the pharmacist and the residents. I have so many mentors at Hartford Hospital. I loved getting to really know people on a personal level. And similar to Haley, it was perfect because I had my 3 rotations there. And then I was also able to go to other hospitals as well. So I know the Rhode Island Hospital longitudinal API is all 6 rotations there. And some of our peers absolutely love that. But for me, I wanted to do, to experience other hospitals in addition to Hartford Hospital.
And so I did the Yale New Haven health longitudinal program, and theirs is a little bit different than the other 2 just because theirs is actually a like longitudinal API within the health system, not necessarily at one of their hospitals. And so kind of through that application process, you rank the top 3 choices of different hospitals. So you have Yale New Haven Hospital in New Haven, you have Bridgeport Hospital, you have Lawrence Memorial, which is in New London, Connecticut, and then Westerly in Rhode Island is also part of theirs. So you rank your top 3 hospital choices of kind of where you would like to do your rotations. And then they have 2 different categories is how they classify their some of their choices. So for Yale New Haven, their longitudinal is actually 4 of your rotations. So I did my institutional, my gen med is also part of that, as well as 2 electives. So the way that they have you choose your electives is that they actually have them split into 2 different categories. So they have what they consider more of like their clinical electives, and then they have, I forget what the other category is actually called, but a lot of it's more of kind of like administrative or like not so clinical electives. So I know I personally did a administrative elective rotation, but you can do things like the Outpatient Infusion Center. They have a tech training program that you can help work with, and basically they just kind of train technicians to get their national certifications. And there's a couple other options there as well. Similar to Megan, they don't guarantee that all of your rotations are going to be consecutive. So like I had my first block, I had off my second block, and then I had 2 blocks in a row at Yale New Haven Hospital. And then I actually am doing my last rotation with the longitudinal right now. So they were kind of separated out a little bit. And even the nice thing is even if you're at different hospitals, all of your onboarding is still the same. All of your paperwork is still the same. All of your login and access is all of the same. And one of the things that I liked about their longitudinal program is that you don't necessarily have to like individually seek out like research opportunities. So at the beginning, towards the beginning of the longitudinal, it's their residency program director actually kind of runs all of the longitudinal students, and they send out an email of all of like the resident projects that are getting worked on throughout the year, since they have so many PGY1 residents, and you have the opportunity as a student to be able to rank like basically like options of projects that you would like to be a part of. So it's a good way to kind of get involved. And I know the project that I worked on with one of the residents, I didn't necessarily have too much to do with to begin with, but now it's something that like I'm actually doing more work with the pharmacist now without the resident. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of get involved within different projects for the longitudinal with them as well, which I liked.
Awesome. So I believe that was all of our questions. Hopefully we got everybody's question answered. I just want to thank you guys for coming. I think we all learned a lot. So hopefully a lot of people benefited from this. I guess one last thing would be like, do you guys have any just like general advice for, I guess, specifically like P3s like going into residencies?
I just saw one other question too about like how to manage the stress between ranking and like match day. And the answer is you're going to be stressed, and that's kind of what it is. But it's also a pretty busy time. For most of you, you'll be on a rotation, so you'll have something going on and you might be working on top of that. So I think just putting it outside of your brain and understanding that you've done what you can at that point, and when the results come, they're going to come. So just trying to like not think about it and knowing that you've done your part, and by and large, things work out in people's favor. URI for the Northeast was like the top school in match percentage. We matched more candidates than anyone else. So if you're a statistics person, maybe that helps you feel a little bit better. In terms of advice for P3s, I think just using all of your rotations to help you identify what you're interested in. And even if it's a rotation that you're not passionate about, trying to tie it back to something you are passionate about is important. So earlier I said I'm really interested in ambulatory care, but I still had to spend some time in ICU on one of my rotations. But you know, you see enough people with diabetic foot infections, and that kind of ties back to, oh, okay, next time I'm talking to a diabetes patient, I want to be sure to remind them to check their feet, and kind of like seeing that continuity of the healthcare system and using that as a way to learn can be important for you. And then using that to kind of identify things you're interested in can help you identify residencies you'd be interested in too.
I think for P3s too, definitely, like Mike said, take time to kind of figure out what you like, and also don't stress if you're not 100% sure exactly what direction you want to go to. I think that's also something that's really good to figure out while you're on rotations. If you're noticing you like a lot of things but don't know exactly what area you want to specialize in, kind of start to notice what you like about your sites. Did you like being at a bigger hospital? Do you want to be at a smaller hospital? Do you want to be at an academic medical center? And if you know really well, if you start knowing what you want to do, say you absolutely loved a critical care elective, which is kind of what happened to me. I looked at sites that had PGY2 opportunities. And then say you really don't know what you want to specialize in, you can find a site that offers a lot of different electives and a lot of different flexibility to try different things. So just figuring out both what you like as far as topics, and then also what type of site you like, whether it's big or small.
My piece of advice for P3 students is treat every rotation and every person you meet like it's a job interview, because chances are you're going to run into them sometime in the future. Pharmacy is a very small world. So if you do mess up on one rotation, someone else in another hospital, another pharmacy will hear about it. So just treat basically every day like it's a job interview, and create network opportunities. Just introduce yourself to everyone you see, because most likely, as I said 5 seconds ago, pharmacy is a very small world.
Going off of what Erin said, when you're on rotations, your preceptors are going to be writing your letters of recommendations if you do want to pursue residency. So it's really important that you do establish those relationships with them, and they see that you're working hard on their rotation, that you're being engaged, you're progressing throughout those 6 weeks. So it is really important that you are able to do all that during rotations and have that relationship with your preceptor, because what they write on your letter of recommendation will greatly influence your residency path. So it is really important. Treat every appy like a interview, because like Aaron said, it's a very small world, and like how you interact with them definitely will come back. So it's very important.
Choose your writers wisely. If it was someone that provided you negative feedback, and not necessarily harsh feedback, but if they say, hey, like, I really think you could improve in these areas, but then they're like, but I'm still willing to write you a letter of recommendation, definitely take a moment to think about if that's the person you want to write you one, or if it's the preceptor that says, it's been a pleasure having you. I really, hope that we cross paths in the future.
To add just a little bit to what Mike was talking about with like stress, I think it's also just important to make sure, as all of my friends here kind of know, how I handle stress is very different than how a lot of other people do. So like just making sure that your friends and like the people around you kind of know what you want and you need, whether it's talking about things, not talking about things. Personally, I was very happy to listen to all my friends, but didn't want them asking me questions about things, which they all knew and were very respectful of. So just kind of knowing like and making sure that the people around you kind of know what you want and need. And in terms of advice, I would just say that don't be afraid to ask your preceptor. It's like you need something to change or you want to do something during your rotation. I fortunately had a preceptor that was like super, super open about any feedback or like asking me about changes. And I'm a very hands-on learner. So one thing that I would, was able to talk to her about was like her letting me do things more independently, which ended up making the rotation like an amazing experience for me. And I got so much more out of it because I was just able to have that more like open line of communication with her that I was able to like utilize going forward. And it was definitely something that I wished I had learned earlier on, that like your preceptors are there to help facilitate your education. And that like, if you need something, you feel like you're missing something, just ask them.
All right, guess I'll close it out if we can. I guess really what I'm going to say is that you get what you put in, if that makes sense. So like if you put a lot of effort into something, even if it's not something that like a rotation that you especially liked at the end of the day, because everyone has one of those, it also sort of teaches you exactly what you don't want in the future or in any kind of like, like career setting or any possible residency setting. And then I guess I just want to add this little caveat, just make sure that if you do end up trying to pursue a residency, that it definitely aligns with your goals, because at the end of the day, residency is not the end all be all. And I really wanted to emphasize that because I know we put like a strong emphasis on it. But that being said, just, is if it does align with your goals, then, do your best. I'm sure that you'll do perfectly. You'll be where you need to be. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to all the P4s that took out their time. I know they're busy with their rotations and everything like that. So thank you guys again for coming. Yeah, if you guys, if any of the P4s are willing to put in their emails or anything like that, if you guys have any other questions or anything, definitely reach out to them. And this is being recorded, so if you guys want to look back on it or anything, I can definitely send that out. But I think that's going to be it. So thank you guys again. Have a great night, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kenzie.
Thank you.
For having us.
Thanks. Good luck on the rest of your rotations.
Thanks. You too. Good luck going into
Super
P3
fun.
here.
Oh God.
Yeah, good luck.
Stress.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Thank you. Have a good night.